This week, for my tour around the National Park Service, let's go visit Fort Scott in Kansas. Yes, you might have noticed it's another military fort. But let's face it, between the War of 1812, the expansion of the frontier that required kicking out entire societies, America's entry into global trade, and then that thingy that marks the end of this season, the Civil War, the 19th century is a very fighty century. So there are lots of forts from this time period. And in these forts, they had to feed a lot of people. And they kept pretty good records for funding and orderliness and stuff, which for our purposes make them a useful place to research historical food. And in this case, it makes Fort Scott a great place to talk about bread and ovens. And it's also front-loaded with a few fun historical facts. The fort is located in Bourbon County, Kansas, which was named as such because a large number of the first white residents who moved to the area were from Bourbon County, Kentucky, which, if you recall, was named that in a tribute of some sort to the French royal house of Bourbon. It's funny how these names can travel for more and more attenuated reasons. Anyway, as a fort on the edge of, past the edge of 19th century America, the comforts of home were lacking and far away. After all, there were the Ozark Mountains and the Missouri swamps between that fort and any federal decisions. The other thing that was lacking? Professional bakers and cooks, so every 2 weeks a new member of each company at the fort was responsible for making the food, and another one was responsible for baking the bread. Up to 250 loaves a day in the fort's massive brick oven. As an industrial oven, this bake oven had a firebox on the side that would heat up the oven and keep the heat flowing. And this was a major step up from those beehive or mound-shaped ovens of the 18th century. But these bakers were given no instructions on how to make the bread. Instead, they were given ingredients and guidance as to what the bread should look like when it was done. That is, the weight of each loaf, how brown it should be, and that it had to sit for 1 to 2 days before the soldiers could eat it. Which meant, that's right, no hot bread for the soldiers. For some reason, people had decided that maybe yeast was dangerous or something, so you had to wait until the yeast was definitely dead and couldn't hurt them. Now, the 19th century was the start of purposeful mass production in America, even or especially in the military. So to see what that looked like in the bread department, the restored and operational bakehouse at Fort Scott is a great place to see what it took to make 19th century bread at scale. Located a bit to the west of the Great Lake of the Ozarks, which is a stunning sight in itself, the city and site of Fort Scott are firmly lodged in the center of the country. Yet at one time, the location of Fort Scott was a major crossroads of indigenous trade at the edge of the far reaches of French ambition and hosted a few quick Spanish appearances. And attracted a whole lot of very head-up feelings when it came to who was going to own the land and for what. So come visit Fort Scott, check out the bread ovens, and see a little more of America, courtesy of the National Park Service. Episode 125. Slow bread, quick bread, iron kettle bread, pan bread. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at some of the 19th century factors that started to change America from a brick oven, slow-rise, free-form loaf bread nation into an iron oven, pan-formed loaf, quick bread nation. So if you want to look into some of the early trends that would lead us to Wonder Bread about 100 years later, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that America used to bake bread just like the European loaves everyone praises as real bread. Picture the items the visual internet went back to as comfort objects during the pandemic. But several things happened at the start of the 19th century that caused America generally to decide that making bread this way was too slow, too unsanitary, or both. And as a result, our bread tastes would wander away from the 17th and 18th century loaves. Now, some of the reasons were valid and practical, and I have sympathy with them. But several others were tied up in making a profit, but those mostly fall into the end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th, so you'll have to wait to see about those. The first big change that started to alter American bread was the shift to iron stoves and ovens. The second change was America getting up and moving west, and for whatever reason doing it the way earlier people had done when they colonized America the first time, often as men without women, or just a few of them, and in small groups rather than as extended families or communities. And guess what? Well, if you've been following along, you'll know that quite often the result was a bunch of miserable, breadless, and beerless men. It's like a replay of the 17th century. Now, in the 17th century, there was really only one way to make a risen bread, with yeast. You had to collect it from the air in a hospitable medium, baby it along, and use it to make slow rise bread, which is what colonial women did once they got here and had the wheat and rye flour that they needed. And so, over the course of the 18th century, wheat and rye spread out over the East Coast along with the larger and ever more automated wind and water mills to grind the grain. This made flour with the requisite stringy gluten proteins necessary to hold all those carbon dioxide yeast burps more available. And so baking days would happen all over America. Brick and stone, dome-shaped ovens were heated up for several hours, and then a succession of breads and pies and little cakes were baked over the course of the day to be consumed during the week. And at the end, the residual heat would be used to do things like dehydrate herbs and fruit, dry flour, or even bake beans back in Boston. In the communities that formed during the 18th century, quite often an oven and the baking responsibilities would be shared among several homes. In villages and towns of any size, a bakery might spring up, often back-to-back or across the street from the brewery for the convenience of getting the barm, that yeasty foam that bubbles up and floats on top of brewing beer. Yet even when a baker had ready access to barm, it still meant that baking was really a 2-day activity. But 19th century bakers had a few advantages compared to their earlier counterparts. When it came to capturing yeast, savory potatoes and hops were now readily available and provided a good food source and home for the yeast with a little disinfecting power. And when it came to raising baked goods on the quick, they had some chemical yeast to work with. But let's face it, when it came to the yeast stuff, all in all, the process hadn't changed that much from the centuries before. Now, if you're curious, how does one make or actually collect yeast and start a colony? Well, a great place to look is at any how-to on making a sourdough starter from wild yeast. But if you want to go truly 19th century on the task, get yourself some taters. Savory or white or Irish potatoes started to be widely available in the first half of the 19th century, and as a result became a favorite medium for creating or really collecting and growing yeast, even if the bakers didn't really understand how it all worked. To do this, take a potato, peeled, and place it in a small pot with just enough water to cover it. Fight every instinct you have to salt it, and do not add salt. Now bring this to a low boil and keep going until the potato is nice and soft, about 10 or 15 minutes. Mash it, place it in a clean quart or liter wide-mouth jar, and fill that with the cooking water. The cooking water is actually an ideal medium since it has potato starch in it, and any tap chlorine has gassed off, and the water itself is basically sterile after that nice long boil. Go ahead and leave this out on the counter for 2 to 3 days. If you live somewhere dusty or you fear a spider parachuting in, you can cover it with a loose weave fabric. Cheesecloth or gauze from that emergency kit you made for Y2K or some other previous disaster are perfect. Once you see a few bubbles on the surface and a few more on the potato sludge, success! Yeast have moved in. Now cover it up, give it a good shake, cover it with a cloth, and leave it out in a warm place for another day or two, and you have got yeast water. You can speed up the whole operation by putting in a tablespoon of sugar. Some people advocate adding a tablespoon or so of flour, and you can do this, but it doesn't seem to particularly help or hurt things. If you're feeling up for a little adventure, you can also add a teaspoon of salt. The result of this is that it inhibits the yeast and makes it more likely that you'll pick up some of the lactic acid bacteria necessary to make a sourdough. And the process will take a few extra days. Now, whether you make the sourdough kind or the plain yeast kind, this yeast seems to need to be made every week or so, if you're not putting it in the refrigerator. Back in the old days, pre-refrigerator, it usually lasted about twice as long in the winter because without refrigeration, if this yeast wasn't used up, it would start to grow mold and other non-bread specific creepy crawlies and get unpleasant flavors. To inhibit the bad stuff, people realized they could add hops to the water. And this worked to keep down the bad microorganisms, but it would add a bitter taste to the yeast water, and it was definitely really noticeable in the more delicate baked goods. So you might ask, how did people decide that putting hops in the yeast water might be a good idea? Well, it comes down to the beer barm. That was consistently good yeast, or at least it was handy. So maybe the hops in there were making the bread a success? Now, here we are saying, well, you could have just tested it. But we have to remember that this whole idea of A/B testing, where you do one thing and then compare it to another thing where you did something different, that sort of regimen that we take for granted, courtesy of the scientific method, were not generally known or practiced. And further, the idea of making up food preparations just to test ideas was seen as, by many, wasteful of time and food. These busy bakers, what they saw was that the beer barm tended to keep well without going sour for a longer period of time than just the plain potato or flour captured yeast. And they thought to themselves, what was the difference between my potato yeast and the barm? Why does that seem to keep better longer? Well, the big difference? Hops. So why not use hops to make the yeast mixtures last longer and, who knows, maybe work better? In the end, hop-laced yeast water, because of its bitter taste, was generally not as popular. There are hop yeast recipes dotting cookbooks, but the potato yeast, apple yeast, how to make dried yeast, and how to keep and feed a levain are much more common, so they were probably much more popular. And if you're wondering, apple yeast, it was made basically the same way potato yeast was made, but it seemed to be tied to making cakes. And it got going faster than potato yeast because there are more sugars in an apple than there are in a potato. But it also tended to go sour pretty fast, so it was often used up in a single baking session. Okay, so now it's clear. Cultivating and using yeast presupposes that you will be stationary for a good long while. Yeast making is a good thing to do when you're at home, but what do you do to raise bread when you can't make yeast when you're on the road? Well, when America hit the trail, as you might imagine, making or babying yeast and then letting bread rise for 24 hours or longer was not on, much less building and heating one of those wood-fired brick or stone or adobe bread ovens. But as we know from previous centuries, Americans refuse to be breadless if they can possibly help it. They will find something to beat the bread. Thus, the quick breads and trail breads of America on the move began their rise. Okay, yes, it's a terrible pun. While plenty of people would bring back the ash cakes of last century in a pinch, the iron coming of age in America meant that 2 or 3 items were usually packed along on the trail, so food no longer had to be cooked in the ashes. And these were the spider, the bake kettle, and the griddle or the hoe. Now the spider is familiar. It's simply that skillet on legs. This 18th century item was a no-brainer to bring along on the trail. It was created to sit over a pile of coals in the walk-in fireplaces that 18th century and earlier cooks used. So clearly the spider was packed along in the ox-pulled wagons and even in hand carts to be placed over the campfires. Bake kettles are now identified as Dutch ovens as legs. including by people like me who hadn't yet sorted out modern terms and found the contemporary names. But yes, these cast iron pots typically had sides that widened out a bit as they rose up to about a height of 4 to 6 inches, that is 10 to 15 centimeters, and had a close fitted lid. True bake kettles also had a lip around the lid that would allow coals to be placed on top, and as a result, it would make a nice little oven right there inside at that 350 Fahrenheit or 180 C. I mean, can you imagine my embarrassment when I was going back over my early episodes as I got further into research and I learned that in the early 19th century, if you said Dutch oven, most people thought you were talking about this sort of tin reflector thing that was used for roasting birds and for making, get this, toasted cheese sandwiches. Yes, in my early episodes, I was wrong about what people called a Dutch oven. Now, the third item that came along for the trek into the wilderness were things that were known as either cooking hoes, fire hose, or griddles. And what they were just slabs of usually cast iron, sometimes wrought iron, that were placed over the fire and were useful for cooking other classes of bready objects more suited to short stays and getting back on the road. The use of these fire hose or griddles also gives me a chance to untangle a bit of food lore that seems to get remixed and repeated every few years. And this is the hoe cake. It's an object that shows up first in written sources in the late 18th century and the early 19th century. The common modern lore is that it was named so because field hands, paid or enslaved, lacking time or the ability to go back to the farmhouse or the cookhouse, would cook a bready item out in the fields upon their hoes, thus the name hoe cake. But if you sit down and think about it for a minute and start to consider the logistics of making a batter and placing it on a hoe over a fire that you have built in a field without matches, the operation doesn't really make sense. Here in the modern age, most of us see hoes hung up in museums or maybe new on racks in gardening stores. In both cases, they are not engaged in their hoeing duties. So the idea vaguely makes sense as a possibility, but out there, in use in a field in the 19th century, agricultural hoes were items covered with dirt, and quite often with noisome animal wastes used as fertilizer. Why in heaven's name would someone even want to use that as a cooking implement? And further, when items like thermoses and Tupperware and Ziploc bags didn't even exist in the wildest fever dreams, and water bottles were more likely to be barrels and tubs, where was someone getting the liquid to make a batter, much less mix it up out in the field to create the supposed hoe cake at all? When you actually go through the steps in something like real time and think about all the equipment you might need, rather than as a nice quick slideshow on TikTok, the ridiculousness of the whole idea becomes a little more clear. But you say, there are things called hoe cakes. Where did those come from, huh? Well, hoe cakes did indeed exist, and they were cooked on something people were calling a hoe. But it was the iron slab placed over the fire, but named hoe because it was a flat slab of iron, like the tool. And there's also some evidence to point to the fact that the sturdy cornmeal griddle cake, wrapped in a bit of scrap cloth and placed in a satchel or a pocket, were taken out in the field by someone who was doing the hoeing. But to cook this thing in the field, that feels rare and or extremely unlikely. On the other hand, these griddles or fire hose were handy for cooking a variety of bready objects, and not just the hoe cakes. Griddle cake was another name given to the wide variety of corn, wheat, buckwheat, rye, and other mixed grain things cooked upon the griddle. And when there wasn't a griddle, they might be cooked in the spider, thus pancake. At other times, their fate was in the name, Johhny cake or Johhny cake. Now, it's not recorded, but I can totally see a harried cook slapping at the hands of people trying to snatch the hot nibbles off her hot griddle. Nope, back off. Those are for the journey. Hands off. In fact, while we're at it, the Johhny cake, Johhny cake thing is one I might as well bring up because in many cases, a Johhny cake and a hoe cake are pretty much indistinguishable, and they fill up the same space in 19th century meals. They are a quick griddle cooked bread, and they almost always contain cornmeal. They can even be all cornmeal, or they can be a mixture of cornmeal and other flours. There are even southern versions that contain rice. In the Carolina rice region, where that was the grain in glut, many recipes for using up rice abounded. Regardless, there are layers here. There's a cornbread object cooked on stones or in the ashes, which has had many names hung on it. There's jannock or bannock from the old Celtic English fire cake, which was often propped up on a board, much the same way a fish was planked, and it gave us the term bannock board, which shows up in some of the 16th and 17th century food writing. Then there's the word jannikin, which is mentioned in some writing as a generic, quote-unquote, Native American or indigenous word. This feels like a hopeful linkage at best. Unlike the word pone, which has a strong link to the Seminole Opone, tracking down the word jannikin in a way that it definitely works to Johhny cake, it's elusive. Much more interesting is the question of who's Johhny? Because the 19th century gets all smushed together, it's even harder to parse. During the Civil War, Confederate soldiers were often called Johnnies, and there's reasonable speculation this has some connection to a well-known Irish ballad, Johhny Has Gone for a Soldier, which was already floating around in pre- and baby America in the 18th century. But it got quite a bit of play in the U.S. as Irish immigrants escaping the Hungry 40s, or the successive potato blights that created famine in the 1840s in Ireland. And as Irish men came off the boats from Ireland, a fair number were scooped up into both sides of the Civil War, but the Union side particularly. And this ballad often appeared side by side with The Minstrel Boy to the War Has Gone, and then to complete the Irish song saga, When Johnny Comes Marching Home was published by one Patrick Gilmore, an Irish-American band leader, in 1863, and that uses a tune that was familiar from a drinking song called Johnny Fill Up the Bowl, which itself was likely an adaptation of another widely used Irish tune. What I'm circling in on is that a wide variety of these usually unsweetened cakes were all over the 19th century travel food scene, and it even crosses over the territory of the slapjack/flapjack name question. So slapjack, as a type of pancake, is a name I ran across frequently in 18th century printed material. And if you spent some time thumbing through stuff from that age, you've likely caught yourself snickering, because this is the point the letter S, when at the beginning or in the middle of the word, is represented by a printed letter that for all the world, to our eyes, looks like a lowercase letter F. You know what I'm talking about if you can hear in your head the word congref or congrefinal. So, depending on when you learn to read and how well, someone else writing in the old style slapjack would easily be read a few years later by somebody else who learned to read and write more recently. They'd see it as flapjack. After all, many of the recipe books would be kept around and added onto for generations. It was not odd to find a book that had 3 or more handwritings recorded in it. The book that became known as Martha Washington's Cookbook is a prime example of this. Okay, so if slapjack was the original name, why did flapjack win? My entirely unprovable guess is that it was just more fun to say, and people in the know probably thought it was pretty funny. Sort of the same way my son laughed himself silly at about the age of 9 years old reading an early 18th century recipe for rabbit pie that called for sucking rabbits. Anyway, whatever you call them, wherever they're from, these heavy cornmeal-based pancakes that could be slipped in a pocket for eating on the road were cemented into the American mind as travel bread or a quick bread for any time. And the griddle or fire hoe and the spider were responsible for them traveling anywhere people were hauling cornmeal and lard as trail food. Some were made with very coarse cornmeal that had to be scalded first to soften it up a bit. This is the same origin as hot water cornbread. And while cornmeal was commonly used for these cakes, in every case, the grain pounded or ground to go into them was simply going to be what was on hand. The fat invariably would have been lard. It traveled well and was packed in barrels for just that purpose. You can go back and ask those cornmeal and lard-fed voyageurs who fell excitedly upon pemmican. Occasionally there might have been butter, but that would have been used to eat the cakes, not as a cooking oil. And as we know from the difficulty of cultivating yeast and bringing it along, most of these cakes were not risen. That is, they had no leavening at all. They were the flattest of flat breads. If you were lucky and around an adventurous cook, you might be treated to a recipe that called for making them with these new chemical yeasts, the pearl ash and the saleratus, and as we covered a few episodes ago, even some of those prairie salts from the bad water pools might have been tried. So unless you had access to those, or maybe you found some eggs from a ground nesting bird, and this did happen on occasion, most Johhny cakes and all their brethren were a bit leaden. Now, a skilled cook could make them light with a very delicate touch, a hot fire, and a little extra fat. Those folks were few and far between and incredibly treasured when they were found. Now, when a griddle finally had a chance to sit still, and yeast making was able to occur, but there still wasn't time for the whole bread rigmarole with the oven, yeast-raised muffins could happen. These were made with a thinner dough than bread, so they raised faster and cooked faster. And if you saw them, you'd immediately recognize them as our modern English muffin. Now that recognition that thinner dough, or dough with a higher water content, could rise faster than stiffer dough, baking this faster rising bread in a pan that shaped it definitely started to give these women out on the pioneer fringes some ideas. See, unlike the communal baking they might have participated in around the bread ovens back east or in the old country, many women traveling were often expected to do their womanly chores alone, baking and cooking and cleaning and sewing and caring for the children, the small livestock, cleaning birds and fish in the kitchen, putting up the extras for the hungry months. It was a lot. And don't even get me started about laundry. And even these women who had maybe more means. Sure, they could get hired help in to do the laundry, but even they didn't have access to a bakery to take some of the load off. Not a single one in sight. So it meant even for women provided with servants or older children to help out with all the things they had on their plate, stoking a bread oven and forming freeform loaves and waiting for them to rise for however long was often just too much. And many of the women isolated from community in their frontier cabins didn't even have any of that sort of help. So faster bread, baked in these faster heating iron ovens, or griddle breads, or baked kettle breads, or pan-cooked breads, they started to become the American way. The railroad and cookery in railroad kitchens and steamship galleys will add to the American love of rolls and muffins and quick breads and breads that can be conveniently baked in rectangular pans. And of course, it will fit in with the adoption of these smaller volume iron stoves in smaller spaces. Now, brick oven bread will continue through much of the 19th century. Freeform loaves still have some time on the American scene. But our propensity to head out on the trail and go it alone means that the rhythm of slow rise bread and the community of the bake oven are on the way out. Convenience and speed, even for bread, is steadily elbowing its way in. Now, for those Americans staying at home, even if they aren't up for bread changes, how did they feel about some updated 19th century pudding? Next time, I'll look into how iron stoves and impatience with bread also led to the transformation of old world savory puddings into the American sweet puddings we know now. There are plenty of stops along the way that don't make it to the 20th or the 21st century, but they were popular in the 19th. Yet with all that, by then, the American boiled pudding had pretty much faded away. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Thanks again for your new reviews. If you haven't done it, well, it's never too late. I will keep making connections with industry and war and fashion and food preferences. Knowing that you're enjoying the episodes keeps me going. Do you want more food and history in your future? Well, I am still doing a deep dive into the 19th century with a co-host, Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength, and our much looser and rather wilder podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. And after the Shogun thing, we are deep back into the 19th century. And right now, we are starting to cover Zorro. Sure, he seems to be mostly an early 20th century invention, but he roams 19th century California and gives us a window into the Spanish connection to early America. There doesn't seem to be much food yet, but tons of fashion, tons of fighting, and all sorts of enjoyable telenovela hijinks and picturesque dramatic slow-mo. Still not E for everyone, but incredibly fun. Music for this podcast is Finger Olympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.